Well, the first time they were in a room together was probably in 1907 in London, and it's sort of a sign really of how unlikely it was that the Bolsheviks were ever likely to take power. You know, they were having these sort of clandestine meetings in shabby rooms, and in a city far, far away from the country they all came from. And to Trotsky that was there, Stalin was there, but actually, although Trotsky was by far and away the best known and had a figure between him and Stalin, Stalin was barely recognised outside the Kremlin. Not long before his death, he wrote sort of what he described as his final testament, because his health was a bit wobbly for a while. It's a document which shows how undimmed and how brightly his passion for revolution still burned. I don't think there was any diminution in his obsession with the idea of sort of turning the world upside down.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome Josh Ireland. He is an acclaimed writer and historian who has written books such as The Traitors and Churchill and Son. Today we discuss his new book, The Death of Trotsky, the true story of the plot to kill Stalin's greatest enemy, which explores the operation that led to the assassination of the Bolshevik revolutionary in 1940. Thank you, Josh, very much for taking time to join us.
So pleased to be on your show. Thank you.
Would you like to introduce the book to the listeners?
So the book is, well, as you've already explained, it's an account of the assassination of Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, the Bolshevik leader. And what first drew me to the topic was that I'd studied this period when I was at school and then at university, and I even decades on, I realised that I had only a very flimsy understanding of what had happened and why. There were these sort of 3 or 4 details which I knew, and I think many other people do. That I knew that Trotsky had died in Mexico. I knew that the assassin had used an ice pick, but I didn't actually really know what Trotsky was doing in Mexico. And also, unlike many other sort of notable, of the most famous assassinations in history, I didn't know who had wielded that ice pick. And again, I didn't know why. And I thought, it's so interesting. We know who assassinated Julius Caesar or JFK, and we know why they did it, and we know how they did it, and we know the circumstances of those stories. But this is one of the most famous moments in history, and I realized I and very few other people knew a great deal about it. And then I sort of started researching more, and I realized how extraordinary the story, both of how Trotsky and his assassin sort of end up in that room together. The sort of twin paths they walk, which get closer and closer and closer. And then, but even before that, there's this sort of almost Shakespearean psychodrama between Trotsky and Stalin, and then that story sort of transmutes into a kind of John le Carré-like thriller. And I thought, that's exactly something I want to spend the next couple of years working on. And that's sort of the genesis of the book and what I think makes it an unusual and exciting story.
When did Trotsky and Stalin first meet, and what caused their mutual dislike?
Well, the first time they were in a room together was probably in 1907 in London, and it's sort of a sign really of how unlikely it was that the Bolsheviks were ever likely to take power. They were having these sort of clandestine meetings in shabby rooms, and in a city far, far away from the country they all came from. And to Trotsky that was there, Stalin was there. It was a sort of meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which they were all part of. And Trotsky, writing later, sort of claimed that he had absolutely no memory of Stalin being there, or that if Stalin had been there, he just sort of remained mute during sort of a week of meetings and sort of discussions. But I think that sort of gives a sense of the framework of their relationship. So that they're incredibly different people. So Trotsky's this sort of vain, preternaturally clever, cosmopolitan man who's lived all across Europe, who's sort of conversant with sort of the most sort of fashionable trends in psychotherapy or literature or science, who takes he's a real dandy. He takes care of the way he dresses. He wears beautiful white suits, has a sort of sweep of black hair and a very delicate pince-nez, whereas Stalin is more sort of provincial and sullen and laconic. He's suspicious of everyone he meets. He's barely left Russia. He's got these pockmarked cheeks, and I think they have this sort of instinctive and visceral, it's almost physical, the dislike they have for each other, because they're so different, and they incarnate such different ideas of what a revolutionary can or should be. And I think all of this is, so their personality differences, and one of the other problems is that Trotsky is incredibly haughty. Can be fantastically rude to people, to anyone he thinks isn't as clever as him, which is almost everyone in his, as far as he's concerned. So I think this sort of, all of that attitude sort of gnaws away at Stalin's sort of deep insecurities. But then all of this is supercharged by ambition. Both of them are incredibly ambitious, ruthless people. They both think that they are both of a mind that they know best. And I think they both want that top job when it becomes available. But also the idea that the other person might get it is so repulsive to them. So shatteringly, such a shattering concept that that makes that rivalry even keener.
After Lenin died in 1924, Trotsky was seen by outside observers as his most likely successor. Why did Stalin prevail over him?
Well, I think it was that sort of rivalry, or that competition is always presented as being this sort of life or death struggle in which the sort of outcome hangs in the balance. But actually, although Trotsky was by far and away the most the best known and had a figure between him and Stalin, Stalin was barely recognized outside the Kremlin, whereas Trotsky's face would have been reproduced across the whole of the Soviet Union as it became. His picture would have hung in households and institutions across alongside Lenin, and it was Trotsky who had this incredible, he had become a sort of a kind of antichrist-like figure in the West. That he along with Lenin were the people that were seen as being sort of intimately connected with the Russian Revolution, and who they were the people that sort of stalked like specters in that Western imagination. But actually, by the time that Lenin had died, Stalin had already begun accumulating the sort of bureaucratic power that he would then wield against Trotsky. He has this sort of strange. There's a kind of strange dichotomy in his character, in that we remember him quite rightly as this sort of psychopathic murderer, a man who has the sort of blood of millions of people on his conscience, or should have the blood of millions of people on his conscience. But he was also incredibly good with people. He understood what people needed and wanted. He remembered people's birthdays. He bought them thoughtful presents. And he furthered. There'd be these young, ambitious people from all over Russia, and he would help them into positions. And so that meant two things. One, there was this kind of cadre of people within the Soviet political machine who were loyal and grateful to Stalin, but also that he had these people he had his own men in these positions, and he since 1917, over the previous just over a half decade, he'd been so good at making sure he was always sitting on the right committee, making sure he was the person that would do the jobs that everyone else thought were beneath him, and didn't realize that as he was doing this, he was also accumulating an incredible amount of power. And then he was very, very good at sort of, what we sort of see as politics. He was good at forming alliances with and against people. He could sort of outmaneuver Trotsky in the Politburo. And all the while this was happening, Trotsky was sort of powerless against it. He didn't really understand how power worked. He didn't understand how you formed alliances. Every time he got close to being able to do that sort of thing, he'd offend the person involved, or he'd fall sick, or he'd disappear for inexplicable reasons. So it wasn't so much of a contest as it was a kind of the first sort of Trotsky's first assassination, really.
You write that when Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, he was surprisingly optimistic about his prospects. What was the reason for his optimism?
Well, I think it's because he'd already been exiled twice, and each time he'd come back to play a sort of significant part in a revolution. And if you sort of to go back to that sort of 1907 meeting, there was nothing in the circumstances of the Bolsheviks at that point, 10 years before they would actually take power, that would have given you any kind of hint at all that within a decade they would be in charge of an empire containing many millions of people. They were shabby, they were powerless, they were being hunted, they were being sort of monitored by spies, there were sort of double agents operating within them. There was no indication that there was any kind of groundswell of support for them or their ideas. And I think that's how Trotsky felt 20 years later. He thought that he'd be able to recreate those circumstances, that a moment would come when he would be able to lead another revolution. And I think the other sort of strand of that is, as a good Marxist, he believed that there were sort of certain inevitable historical forces, and that these they would play out, and that would create another opening for him. So I think that's what it was. And also just, he was incredibly confident in his own ability. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that he was one of the great revolutionaries of the 20th century. So why wouldn't he have another go at a revolution?
Trotsky lived in 4 different countries during his exile. First Turkey, followed by France, Norway, and finally Mexico. What were his experiences in these places?
Well, I think you could sort of group them into two camps. The first 3, Turkey, then France, then Norway. He was he was a guest, but a guest in these countries that no one really wanted. There was this sort of lingering suspicion that if you let Trotsky into your country, he'd try and start a revolution. So he led a sort of for slightly sad, cloistered existence. He knew that his movements were going to be restricted either by the fear that assassins from, whether that's sort of disaffected former supporters of the Tsar, or the Bolsheviks themselves, or any other kind of group of sort of extremists might try and assassinate him. He was always monitored by the sort of secret police of whichever country he was living in at the time. Money was always tight and became tighter as time went on. And he was sort of forced to watch as every supporter he'd ever had was either exterminated in the sort of the bowels of the Bianca or in one of the gulags, or forced to make a sort of humiliating recantation, public recantation of their support for him. And also, as all of this is happening, his family is sort of dying. Whether that's because one daughter died of illness, I think typhoid, because no doctor in the Soviet Union was brave enough to treat her. Another sort of committed suicide out of hopelessness. One of his sons disappeared into the sort of Soviet system. Another died in incredibly mysterious circumstances after a routine operation. So it must have been heartbreaking. No matter how. So Trotsky is absolutely there was no question that Trotsky was a ruthless man responsible for the death of thousands. So he, on that level, it's difficult to feel sympathetic towards him. But he was also a father and a grandfather, and to watch your sort of family and your friends being exterminated must have been heartrending. And to be able to know that you could do nothing about it. And then things change a bit when he gets to Mexico. So he's sort of invited there by the Mexican government, which is led by a socialist President Cardenas, and there was also sort of a group of Trotskyists, notably the incredible muralist Diego Rivera, who invite him to come to that country. And initially, it feels like a refuge. It's miles away from Russia. It's miles away from the sort of the Stalin's networks of agents. But very quickly, his past catches up with him. Very soon he's looking out of the house he's living in, which is Frida Kahlo, who was married to Rivera's old childhood home. This incredible compound. They realized there were people watching them. There were people following them wherever they went. All the same patterns began again. That they realized all their mail was being read. That whatever sort of freedom they thought they might have been able to enjoy in the new world had been sort of snatched away instantly. That when he left the house, it would always be he'd have to sort of, with a police escort, or have to sort of duck down beneath the car seats. But somehow, amidst all that time, he managed to find time to have an affair with Frida Kahlo, which sort of ended badly, and carried on his sort of agitation and his the thing that never changes with him, that never wavers, is his kind of absolute commitment to revolution. He was obsessed, as obsessed with it on the day he died as he was in February 1917.
During his exile, Trotsky continued to engage in political activities. What was his objective with that? Was it to initiate another revolution?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he wanted to sort of raise the consciousness of, as he, in sort of Marxist terms, of the working class in Russia, but also across the world. I think he felt it was his job to sort of educate them and agitate on their behalf. And so I think I think obviously revolution was always his main ambition, because that's what he thought he was on the planet to do. And also I think what he also wanted to do, and spent a lot of his time doing, was sort of prosecute an argument against Stalin and what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union. He had earlier described Stalin as the gravedigger of the revolution. And I think he was horrified by the ways in which Stalin was and wasn't, transforming Russia. Even though many of the things that Stalin was doing were reasonably similar to what Trotsky would have done had he won out in 1924.
Right, okay. In your book, you explore numerous figures who played key roles in the operation to assassinate Trotsky, including the assassin Ramon Mercader, intelligence officer Leonid Eitinger, and many others. Could you discuss some of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that most attracted me to the story, was not just Trotsky himself, but also the other sort of, cast of characters within the story. And sort of the most important really are the Mercader family, notably Ramon, the man who would eventually wield the ice pick, but also his mother, Caridad, who is the kind of motor of the whole story, really, because it's her who ends up facilitating her son's recruitment into the NKVD, or to be recruitment as an NKVD agent. She's this complex, charismatic, turbulent figure. There's a moment when one of her sons is walking down the street with her, and he says, "Mother, why is everyone looking at you?" And she says, "But everyone is always looking at me." She must have been an incredible sort of force of nature. And one thing leads to another. And in the middle of the Spanish Civil War, where both Caridad and Ramon are fighting on the side of the Republic, Ramon meets the other very significant person in his story, his side of the story is Leonid Eitingon, who's a NKVD agent from what's now Belarus, I think, who may or may not have been having an affair with Karadad. I mean, he seemed to sleep with most women he met. And he, again, is an extraordinary figure. You know, he's sort of carefree. See, on the face of it, carefree, elegant, cheerful, but you know, completely ruthless, willing to do everything necessary to sort of, you know, further the policies and aims of the Soviet Union. And so they sort of draw Ramon, who is as committed an idealist as anyone in this story. You know, it's a doctrinaire Stalinist who sort of had incredibly ironclad, you know, views of the world and the great experiment that Stalin was involved in the Soviet Union, even though a country he'd never visited. And you know, he's handsome, he's charming, he's sort of strong, an incredible shot, has sort of almost preternatural sort of senses, can tell great stories, and is a sort of fluent liar. So, you know, all the qualities one would want in a spy. And initially, he's recruited and he's recruited by the Soviets without any particular goal or aim. They just see him as someone who could be very useful in the future, which is something they did a lot, and you know, Russia kind of continues to do in you know, now. And then in sort of summer of 1938, they realized they had the job that they wanted him. The first job they wanted him to do, which was to seduce a naive young American Trotskyist called Sylvia Agaloff, who was traveling to Europe. The NKVD had actually sort of massively overstated her involvement in the Trotskyist movement. I think they mistook her for her sister, who had briefly been Trotsky's secretary. But she was traveling to Europe, and during the course of that visit, she was going to sort of attend a conference of Trotskyists. So Ramon begins to sort of pose as a sort of dissolute Belgian playboy, sports reporter called Jacques Mornard, and he seduces her, and they begin a love affair. And then for the next year or so, you know, he sort of continues to lie. She has brief moments of wondering whether any of the stories or all of the stories are true. He tells her are true, but something keeps her going. I think there have been people who have sort of argued that actually she wasn't a patsy, that she was as sort of implicated in the whole plot as anyone else. I'm not sure about that. I think sometimes the sort of simplest explanation is true. I think she just, you know, she was just enraptured by this handsome, charming, suave human being. Couldn't believe that he was sort of had waltzed into her life, and it was easier not to ask too many questions. But eventually, so still at this stage, you know, he has, you know, effectively a sort of watching brief. He's a spy more than he's an assassin. He's there to find out as much as he can, to report on who he sees, who he meets. And this continues when he and Sylvia moved to Mexico, where she quickly starts to, you know, visit Trotsky in his compound. And that's where, you know, the story begins to pick up a new, more momentum.
Had Trotsky evaded assassination, what activities might he have pursued throughout the remainder of his life?
I think his life would have carried on in exactly the same way. You know, he would have given speeches, he would have written books, he would have continued meeting people, and I think he would have carried on waiting for the opportunity that he would probably have remained as confident as ever that was going to come. You know, not long before his death, he wrote a sort of what he described as his final testament, because his health was a bit wobbly for a while. You know, it's a document which shows how undimmed and how brightly his passion for revolution still burned. I didn't think there was any diminution in his obsession with the idea of sort of turning the world upside down.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
Well, obviously, I think, you should always go for an independent bookstore, but failing that, Waterstones, and failing that, Amazon.
Josh, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you great success with your book.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.